Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another Adventures in Eagle Territory. My name is Scott Mehus, and I'm the Education Director at the National Eagle Center in Wabasha, Minnesota. Today, I'd like to share with you some information about Tundra Swans. Tundra Swans are in the process of utilizing the river valley here on one of their last legs of their journey before they head to the east coast along the Chesapeake Bay. And right now, you are still able to see in many parts of the river valley large numbers of swans that look like that. Looks like popcorn spread out onto the water. There are still opportunities yet this fall and early winter here to see good numbers of swans. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about where to find them. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the tundra swan itself. Now, the tundra swans that we're seeing right now are on their migration. They've nested up in the Arctic tundra in the areas there in black on the top there. That is where they have spent the summers and raised their families. And then the blue dash marks you can see are where the birds migrate through, right through Minnesota, Wisconsin, as they work their way towards the east along the Chesapeake Bay. Areas of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, even down in North Carolina. That is where the swans, the tundra swans, are going to be spending the winter. But they come through this area in mid to late October. They start arriving, and use the peak of the migration is sometime in the middle of November. And because we've had fairly mild temperatures this fall, we've been seeing still large numbers of swans in the area. And so here's an opportunity for you to do that yet this fall. And I'll share with that directions at the end of this video. But for now, back to the tundra swans. There are several different types of swans in North America. There are two of them that are native. They are the trumpeter swan and the tundra swan. The tundra swan is the bird over here. That is the bird that we're talking about today. But the other species of swan that's native to North America is the trumpeter swan that is also found in Minnesota year-round. It's a bird that breeds here in Minnesota and Wisconsin during the summer months, and then occasionally overwinters in areas where there is open water along the Mississippi River. Now, the trumpeter swan is a species of swan that unfortunately was decimated in numbers. And thankfully, back in the 70s and the 80s, the Three Rivers Park District, which was then known as the Hennepin Park District, Minnesota DNR, Non-Game Wildlife, and the Minnesota Zoo all collaborated together to reintroduce the trumpeter swan back into the state of Minnesota. And thankfully, they did that because the numbers are now increasing in good, steady climb, and they are found across most parts of the Minnesota. You could see a trumpeter swan during the nesting season. The tundra swans are the birds that are only here during the winter. Now, the other type of swan that is found in North America, but is not native, is the bird over here on the left, and that is the mute swan. The mute swan is native to the Europe and areas there, and is a bird that is often featured in fairy tales. It's the bird that you see with the arched neck and the wings up over the back. It is the bird that is often an escape from zoos and gardens, and there is some small populations across the country, but it is not a native species. Now, down in the front there of the swans, you've been seeing some eggs. Those are the egg of a chicken on the left. The bird egg in the middle is a bald eagle for comparison. And the bird on the right is the trumpeter swan egg. I do not have a tundra swan egg to show you, but the trumpeter and the tundra swan eggs are very similar. In fact, the two birds are very, very similar to each other and can be very difficult to distinguish between the two. Here are two of them side by side. Here you can see the trumpeter on the top and the tundra on the bottom. Now, a lot of people talk about on the tundra swan that little yellow spot there. We call that the lores. Some tundra swans have that. About 70 to 80% of the population does. But the other part of the population does not. And so don't always rely that if it doesn't have the yellow spot, it's got to be a trumpeter swan. That's not always the case. The key way to remember these two species is time of the year. Anytime throughout the year, you might be seeing a trumpeter swan, but only in the fall and the spring migration are we going to be seeing the tundra swans. The best way to tell them apart is by sound. I don't have a nice little handy-dandy sound thing to do for you, so I'll do it the best I can with my voice. The tundra swan sounds like this. In fact, it used to be called the whistling swan. In fact, it was given that name as Lewis and Clark gave the first written description of the tundra swans during their travels, and Lewis likened that call to whistlings, hence the name whistling swan. The trumpeter swan, to me, doesn't really sound like a trumpet. It sounds more like a out-of-tune French horn. And it sounds like, that is the call of the trumpeter swan. Now, you can go online, for example, to Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and get the real calls if you don't want to listen to my voice and my imitation of those calls. But go to Cornell Lab of Ornithology to get a lot of different bird calls and bird information. Now, the tundra swan nests up in the Arctic tundra. As we mentioned earlier, they lay anywhere from 3 to 6 to 8 eggs. And the nice thing about the swan is they migrate as a family unit. So when we see the birds here, we're going to see the adults. They're the bird, as you see on the left there, with that all white plumage and that black beak, as we can see there. And as we can see on this bird, there is that little yellow spot on the lores. But the bird on the right there has a very different colored beak. That is more of a pinkish colored, and that is the color of the juvenile's beak. Now, the juvenile also does not have bright white plumage. It has kind of a dusky gray plumage. Now, you can kind of see that on the sides of this bird here, that dusky gray plumage. But what you can also see on there is that rust coloration. That is not a natural coloration for the swan. This is a bird that had been feeding in a pond rich in ferrous materials, and so those feathers were stained over time, and so that is why that bird has that rust-colored plumage. You'll often see that, especially on the heads of even the adults, as they're digging down in the mud looking for food. They will often stain those feathers with that iron-like material in the soil. Now, what are the swans here feeding on? When they're here in the river valley, they're getting ready for the next leg of their journey, which may be over 1,000 miles yet to get to Chesapeake Bay along the Atlantic coast. And so they need to fuel up and get a lot of carbohydrates. And one of the plants that they obtain in getting those carbohydrates is the arrowhead plant. Now, you can see the arrowhead leaf there, very sharply pointed there in the picture on the left. On the right there, you can also see the flower of the arrowhead plant. Very beautiful white and yellow flower. Now, in the summertime, these leaves grow several feet up out of the water surface. But in the first cold snap that we get in the fall, the leaves die back, and what's left is the tubers down in the mud. Now, tubers are like potatoes. They're storehouses of energy, rich in carbohydrates. And so there you can see some tubers right there in the middle, next to that chapstick there for comparison. So the swans that you see in the picture here behind the tubers, they are using their webbed feet, very large webbed feet, as you can see, that they're using to dig down into the mud. Once they find the tubers, they then break them loose with their feet, they then reach down with their long necks, and then they swallow these tubers. Now, a study that was done several years ago here in the upper Mississippi River Valley by Eric Thorson from the University of Minnesota found that swans on average spend about 28 days in the river valley here before continuing their migration towards Chesapeake Bay. And while they're here, they're feeding on these carbohydrate-rich tubers. Each swan, they found, eats on average 2 to 3 pounds of these tubers a day. Now, to the left there, you'll see some smaller tubers. Those are tubers from the wild celery that also grows in the river valley, but you can see they're much smaller in size, so not as productive. You'd have to eat a lot more of those as a swan, and so they tend to eat the ones there. Now, those tubers there that I have are dried out, and so the fresh ones can be a little bit bigger than that. Now, the Native Americans that lived in this area, the Dakota, they utilize the tuber and used it very similar to a potato. In fact, they called it duck potato or wapato. Wapato was the name that they gave that. Now, the swans, once they leave here, they're going to continue their migration, and they migrate as a family unit. So you will see both the mom and the dad with that bright white plumage and the dark bill next to the juveniles. Oftentimes it's 3 to 4 is the number of juveniles that you'll see with a family, and that is going to be more of that dusky color with that pinkish colored bill. They will migrate as a family unit to Chesapeake Bay. They'll winter there together. They'll come back through Minnesota and Wisconsin in the late February and early March. Now, then they won't stay quite as long because then they are anxious to get back up to the breeding territory, up on the breeding grounds, up in parts of Canada and Nunavut, for example, where they're going to be spending the summer raising those families. Now, the male of a swan is called a cob, while a female is called a pen. And the baby swan, like we're seeing there on the right, is called a cygnet. Now, tundra swans have over 23,000 feathers. 23,000 feathers. Compare that with a bald eagle, similar sized bird, at about 10 to 12 pounds, having only about 7,000 feathers, which is still pretty impressive. But the Tundra Swan here, weighing on average 15 to maybe up to 20, has over 23,000 feathers. Now, the Trumpeter Swan, as we said earlier, is a little bit bigger. They can be over 20 pounds in size for them. Tundra swans are known to fly several hundred miles a day on their migration flights. They fly about 18 to 30 miles per hour. Though with a tailwind, flocks have been clocked at 50 to 60 miles per hour. And they also fly high too, often at 6,000 to 8,000 feet. So now is the time to be coming down for the next week or so here before the cold temperatures sneak up on us and seeing Tundra swans in our river valley. And we do have guides on our website that you can go to and find out about some of the best spots. One of the better spots in our area right now is south of La Crescent, Minnesota. In fact, 13 miles south of La Crescent, Minnesota, between the town of Reno and Brownsville. Brownsville and Reno, right along in there is a good spot to see the swans. The Upper Mississippi Wildlife Refuge folks have built a wonderful platform there where you can come and check it out. But there are other spots up and down the river, and we have those listed on our website. So check out our website to learn about those and also our eagle watching sites as well. I mentioned earlier that Eric Thorson from University of Minnesota found that swans spent on average of 28 days here. Probably wondering, well, how did they find that out? Well, one of the ways they did that is they put on neck collars. I had the opportunity to go out with the researchers at Rick's Lake over by Alma quite a few years ago, and we went out there at night in boats with these big flashlights. And once we found a bird that we were looking for, we shined the light on them. That kind of disorientated them. We then went over and grabbed the bird, and it would literally take 2 people to hold down the swan. They are that strong. Then the researcher then had an opportunity to take blood samples, feather samples, and then attach these neck collars. Now, some of the birds also had satellite transmitters attached to those neck collars as well, but those may only last for 3 or 4 years or less. But with the neck collar, that will be on there for quite some time, and so that bird may be seen for many years in a row. In fact, we had a swan that was seen for about 6 years in a row, almost on a daily basis during the fall season at Alma. Its number was K744. Maybe some of you were down at Alma years ago may have seen K744, a bird that we saw every single fall. But right now, as I mentioned earlier, there are other spots to see the swans as the Ricks Lake area has filled in with sediment. So lots of other places to check out. So I encourage you to go to our website and check it out. Once again, thank you for tuning in to Adventures in Eagle Territory, learning today about the migratory population of the Tundra swans that migrate through our area in the fall and winter.